My name is Wolf Gruner. We are a little bit behind schedule because of the delicious lunch. I'm the director of this USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and I am thankful for you all for your interest in coming. And it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Kimberly Cheng. But first I want to acknowledge what actually made it possible that she is here with us doing research at USC. And this is thanks to a fellowship which is granted by Gerald Breslauer, Mickey Rutman, Tammy Anderson, Sharon DeGrave, and Tammy and Sharon are present today. So we are very thankful for this. And what is really exciting about this is that this fellowship enables a PhD candidate to do innovative research for 1 month here on site with the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation. So this is what Kimberly is doing right now. She is a doctoral candidate in the joint PhD program in Hebrew, in Judaic Studies and History at NYU. I know her for a longer time because she had an eye also at USC, and not at least for the Shoah Foundation testimonies, and so she now takes advantage of this fellowship to come here. So she is our 2018-2019 Breslauer, Rutman, and Anderson Research Fellow. And what is so special about her that she is actually combining 2 avenues of research. One is in Jewish history and the other one is in Chinese history. And this comes together in the topic of her dissertation, but where part of this is you will hear about today. So her dissertation specifically examines Central European Jewish refugees in Shanghai during World War II, and with a special kind of a focus on memory and gender. She is a recipient of some other fellowships and worked also as a research intern for the Roman Vishniac Archive at the International Center of Photography. And I think, so she combines several interesting skills already at this early stage of her academic career, and I think give her a warm hand, and we are very interested in her presentation. And I forgot, not only she combines different avenues and different skills, she has also several languages at her hand, and I'm especially jealous because she masters Hebrew, where I failed tremendously.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Wolf, for that kind introduction. I first want to say what a privilege and an honor it's been to be here as a fellow at the USC Shoah Foundation. And I definitely owe, first and foremost, a very large thank you to Wolf Gruner, Martha Stroud, Badema Pittick, and Isabella Lloyd-Damjanovic for their support and guidance. And I also would very much like to thank Jerry Breslauer, Mickey Rutman, Tammy Anderson, and Sharon DeGrave for their encouragement and support of my work. Last, I wanted to express my gratitude to everyone here at the USC Shoah Foundation community, and really the USC community at large, for being so open and welcoming during my stay here. So today, I'm going to give a brief overview of my dissertation and provide some of the background history on this topic before launching into my research on the post-war period that I've been undertaking here at USC. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this topic, approximately 17,000 to 18,000 Central European Jewish refugees found refuge from Nazi persecution in Japanese-occupied Shanghai during World War II. This topic has remained largely excluded from Holocaust history because it lies beyond the geographical scope that we think of when we think of the Holocaust. Because researchers in the Holocaust field have primarily focused on Europe and the West, studies of Jewish refugee migration have mostly looked at migration to other destinations in Europe, to the United States, and also to Palestine. Only more recently have scholars started to consider refugee migration to non-European and most importantly, non-Western destinations. And this is where I think Shanghai fits in as a particularly noteworthy case. Because Shanghai's Jewish refugees fled the Nazis to then come under the control of the Japanese, who were occupying Shanghai at the time, they stood at an intersection between the European and Pacific theaters of World War II. This case of refugee migration, in my mind, demonstrates the need for us in Holocaust studies to think outside our field, to think along interdisciplinary lines, and to integrate frameworks, perspectives, and approaches, in this case, from East Asian studies. To that end, I will mention that the limited scholarship that's been done on Jewish refugee migration to China has remained separated into silos between Holocaust studies and East Asian studies. Thus, Holocaust scholars have studied the roots of refugee migration to and from China, Jewish communal organization in Shanghai, and the response of global Jewish aid organizations to this population. Concurrently, Asianists have focused primarily on Japanese state policy towards these refugees, and only few have considered the Chinese perspective within this story. To help remedy these gaps, my research focuses on Jewish refugee daily life in Shanghai. In specific, I'm interested in sites of contact between Jewish refugees and their Chinese neighbors, which have often been taken for granted by scholars. Because refugees didn't necessarily endeavor to integrate into Chinese society fully, very little attention has been paid to the types of encounters that refugees had with their Chinese neighbors. Now, these encounters could range from a refugee marrying a Chinese spouse, to refugees just buying vegetables from a Chinese vendor at the market daily, to just passing Chinese children playing on the street and taking note of them. Now, to illustrate this range, I would like to show two photos from the VHA, and I would like to mention that all of the images in this presentation come from within the archives here at the Shoah Foundation. Now, this is a picture of a refugee named Helga Ross, and in her testimony, she recalls having made close acquaintance with this Chinese man on the right, who her and her husband on the left were able to meet, I believe, through organized sports in the city. So this photo and the testimony that accompanies it shows the possibility of making some acquaintances. Now, for those who are not able to have relationships with the Chinese around them, it's still important that they often saw the Chinese living around them and remembered those sites. So this is a drawing by a refugee named Joseph Weber, and here you can see that he's drawn a Chinese rickshaw puller with passengers in this rickshaw. And I think that this drawing is really important because it shows that the Chinese around these Jewish refugees left enough of an impression that refugees wrote about them, spoke about them, and also drew them. So by surveying the range and the limitations to these encounters, and the influence that they had on refugee life, I hope to bring the Jewish and Chinese sides of this story into one frame of reference. In doing so, I believe we can learn a lot about how Jews and Chinese define themselves in the context of their relationship to each other. And also, I believe this process will shed light on Jewish identity formation and the emotions, attitudes, and behaviors that refugees exhibited during their time in Asia. Now, to provide you with some historical background on this topic, Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany started arriving in Shanghai as early as the summer of 1933. Between 1938 and 1941, however, we see the largest wave of refugees come. And these refugees were mostly of German, Austrian, and Polish backgrounds. At this time, many Western countries had strict immigration policies, which barred and deterred European Jewish refugee migration. Shanghai, in contrast, however, had no passport control. In fact, from 1937 to 1939, Shanghai remained one of the only destinations in the world that did not require foreigners to have visas, pre-planned jobs, or monetary guarantees for immigration. Thus, Jewish refugees who found themselves excluded from Western countries often had to settle on journeying to Shanghai, earning the city the nickname the Port of Last Resort. So here in this image, you can see the passport of a refugee named Hermann Kripps. And Hermann Kripps was the father of testimony giver Sonja Mühlberger. And here at the bottom in the German, the subtitle, Sonja is talking about how Hermann had to take the middle name Israel. And so you can see that in the passport. Now, there were two main ways to get to Shanghai. The first one was by sea. So from 1938 to 1940, refugees often took trains to different port cities. Often these cities were in Italy. And they traveled on ocean liners through the Suez Canal or sometimes around the Cape of Good Hope to get to China. The next route was by land. And from 1940 to 1941, because of Italy's entry into World War II and the fact that many of these ports were then closed, refugees took a land route across the Soviet Union on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. They often ended in Harbin, Mukden, or Dalian, where they then took Japanese ships down to Shanghai. So here in this photo, we can see refugee Sigmund Tobias, and he is on an Italian ocean liner, I believe, with his mother. In terms of the history of Shanghai, it's important to note that after the Opium Wars, foreign powers procured extraterritorial rights for themselves that exempted their citizens from Chinese law. This allowed for the establishment of foreign-administered concessions, or really mini-colonies, in newly opened and designated treaty ports, including Shanghai. By the time the first Jewish refugees came to Shanghai, the city remained divided into three main zones: the French concession, the international concession, which was mainly governed by the British and the Americans, and the Chinese city, which was controlled by Jiang Jiechi's Kuomintang nationalist government. Jewish refugees who had more financial resources available to them, either from relatives abroad or through the sale of smuggled valuables, often chose to live in the French concession. This put them close to Shanghai's other European foreigners. The majority of refugees, however, had been stripped of all of their assets by the Third Reich. Thus, they had no choice but to live and seek refuge in a rundown and bombed-out district called Hongkou, which is often pronounced Hongqiu in testimonies. In Hongkou, refugees lived either in shabby studios or flats, or in shelter facilities established by the Jewish community called Haima. So here in this photo, it is another drawing from Joseph Weber, and he is drawing the conditions of living conditions in his Heim. And I believe the bottom, if you can make it out, says, "How I live the past 14 months in Shanghai, in the lower bunk, an unfriendly stranger." Now, the last important piece of context you'll need to understand this story is that in 1937, a year before most Jewish refugees came to Shanghai, the Japanese had successfully taken over Shanghai's Chinese-administered sector during the Battle of Shanghai. And while Hongkou remained a part of the international settlement, Japanese occupation authorities assumed control of its administration as well. So in February of 1943, the Japanese then mandated that all stateless refugees who had come to Shanghai after 1937 permanently relocate their homes and businesses to a 40-block designated zone in the district of Hongkou. To leave the designated area, Jewish refugees needed to acquire passes from Japanese authorities. So here we have the pass of a young refugee named Evelyn, and you can see that it has multiple dates stamped onto it, and that's because these refugees needed to renew their passes every few months. It's important to note that within this designated area, deemed the Hongkou ghetto by many refugees, there also lived Chinese residents. From 1943 onwards, Jewish refugees actually often remembered sharing common experiences of suffering with their Chinese neighbors under Japanese occupation. Now, this joint suffering would last until the end of the war. While the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, we must remember that the war in Asia did not end until August. These few months put great strain on refugees as American bombs were dropped in Shanghai and in Hongkou in July of 1945, causing casualties for both refugees and their Chinese neighbors. When the war finally ended, both populations excitedly watched the Japanese troops pull out of the city, who were quickly replaced with American and Chinese soldiers. In the immediate post-war period, members of the U.S. Army, Army Air Corps, Navy, and Marines were stationed in Shanghai to oversee the handover of the city from the Japanese to the Chinese. More importantly, U.S. armed forces were posted throughout the country to aid Chinese authorities in transferring enemy property, with a key interest in making sure that the Kuomintang Nationalist Party could stay strong in the face of the civil war that was breaking out between the Kuomintang Nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party. It's from this context that my guiding research questions for my time here at the Showa Foundation emerged. With Shanghai being a fully Chinese city for the first time without foreign occupiers, I wanted to know, 1, how did Jewish refugees fashion lives for themselves in post-war Shanghai? Did the post-war period change the relationship between Jewish refugees and their Chinese neighbors? And how did Jewish refugees really remember the post-war period overall? Now, to start right at the beginning of the post-war period, I'd like to show 2 clips. The first one is from a refugee named Walter Frank, who discusses the American bombing of Shanghai.
After all, there were the Chinese on the street who saw the planes too. Hey, American airplanes, great, hooray!
And then they got bombed?
They got bombed. Still hooray. After all, they went out of sight. And the Chinese didn't like the Japanese either. So the Chinese were very happy about the American airplanes coming over and bombing the city, even though they lost people. And we were happy. We lost.
So in this clip, I think it's very important that Walter Frank evidences the happiness that the Chinese around him expressed at the coming of the Americans. And he compares that happiness to the same feelings that Jewish refugees had. As a side note, I think this clip is also very important because it demonstrates that refugees may have understood more Chinese than we previously have acknowledged, and that also refugees were consistently observing the Chinese around them, both during the war and during the post-war period. Now I'd like to show a clip from refugee Peter Shatner, who talks about how the arrival of American troops.
I hope you remember how many days I want the Americans to come.
Saviors came, people were crowding around them, they were standing around them, they were there to liberate us. It was fantastic. I mean, to describe this feeling after all we've been, through, it was almost indescribable. This is feeling of jubilation that the saviors came to Shanghai, to Hongkou is unreal.
So I think that this clip evidences the types of jubilation and feelings of freedom and liberation that refugees felt. And then when we think of these 2 clips in conjunction, we can also imagine perhaps that Chinese in the city may have also felt similar feelings of jubilation at the end of the war. In any case, these joyful feelings of liberation actually stand in stark contrast with how Jewish refugees and Chinese actually experienced the post-war period. Although the end of the war did free both groups from Japanese oppression, it brought disappointments for both populations as well. Throughout the war, Jewish refugees had dreamed of the day that they could emigrate freely out of China. Often they dreamed of the United States. But after the war, few countries welcomed them. In fact, up until 1948, there were approximately still 10,000 Jewish refugees left in Shanghai. Although President Truman had widened the number of refugees of German origin who could come to America under the quota system in 1945, there was still little room for refugees who were Austrian or Polish. As for Shanghai's Chinese, China's newfound sovereignty only highlighted the struggle that was breaking out between Kuomintang nationalists and the Chinese communists. As the violent strife between both factions deepened, many Shanghainese were underwhelmed and disillusioned by the nationalist takeover and administration of the city. Chinese on the ground also now found themselves at the behest of yet another foreign contingent, the Americans. Caught in between the growing friction between the Chinese and the US armed forces in the city, refugees started to align themselves more with the Americans. My research shows that many refugees started acting as future Americans by practicing American behaviors and working for American troops. Others simply pretended to be American for their own gain. Now, Jewish refugees had dreamed of resettling in the US long before the US troops had arrived in Shanghai. For these refugees, the influx of American armed forces into Shanghai presented an opportunity for refugees to become quasi-Americans. In the post-war period, refugees remembered taking on American customs and practicing American culture. They ate American foods for the first time, they copied American accents that they heard on the street, and they endeavored to incorporate American slang into their speech. One of the biggest ways refugees learned to be American, though, was through working for the American armed forces themselves. Offering wages in US dollars, the American forces in Shanghai needed to quickly fill support and service positions. Younger Jewish refugee men and women who often spoke English and varying levels of Chinese were almost perfect candidates for these support roles. They often also edged out local Shanghainese for these employment opportunities. From my research here at the VHA, I was able to survey the range of these positions. In example, Walter Frank on the left got a job at Air Transport Command doing general statistics. He then moved up to be the chief clerk of that department. So his jobs included making sure that all the morning reports went out and that aircraft reports and aircraft service reports were maintained and issued. Peter Shatner on the right also did general clerking, writing the garrison morning reports for the US Army for a certain garrison. He also did a stint in Manchuria where he worked helping hand over American military equipment to the Chinese Kuomintang nationalist troops in Manchuria. Now, another key job that refugees had was that of exchange assistant. So refugees, such as Herbert Jelinek, in their testimonies, remember working for the Post Exchange or also the base exchanges, which were major retail centers for troops. Jelinek was an exchange assistant before he became the supervisor of an American warehouse, of an armed forces warehouse. Refugees also had general service jobs. So this is refugee Eugene Katz, and in his testimony, he remembers being a baker on a US Navy ship. So he lived on the ship, he had a bunk there, and he served members of the US Navy their food every day. So he remembers learning to make pie, because he had never made pie before. And he also remembers having the privilege of being able to wear some US Navy uniform items, even though he wasn't truly a member of the US Navy. And this picture evidences that he's wearing some particular uniform items. So through jobs such as these, Jewish refugees were able to adopt American customs and even present themselves as Americans, as we can see from Katz's photo. It's important to note that because refugees were paid in US dollars, those who worked for the American Armed Forces also saw their standards of living rise. There's evidence to believe that refugees who did not officially work for the US Armed Forces still benefited from even just associating with US soldiers. So for example, the testimony of Rita Fetter shows such a case. So Rita remembers that she made 2 friends with actually Jewish GIs in Shanghai from New York. And so when these GIs would receive packages from their parents back at home, they often gave them to Rita's family. The testimony of Peter Sonnenfeld also shows a similar case. So Peter Sonnenfeld remembered having a chance encounter with American soldiers on the street. They asked him to do some translation work, and in return, he received an abundance of extra food. So refugees who definitely worked with the armed forces, but even those who just associated with US troops, often saw their standards of living climb. At the same time, many Chinese did not experience a rise in their standards of living. Particularly, we can imagine those in Hong Kong. Chinese in the city often faced a lack of housing and employment. They also received less aid from relatives abroad than Jewish refugees, and actually they also received less aid from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration than Jewish refugees as well. So as early as in December of 1945, we see the first instances of Chinese demonstrations taking their anger out on Jewish refugees. Representatives from the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee reported that Chinese protesters in Hong Kong, embittered by housing shortages, demanded the evacuation of Jewish refugees. These protests continued, as in 1946, the JDC also recorded that Chinese demonstrators started using slogans that compared Jews to the Japanese. The testimonies of Jewish refugees in the VHA also evidence an uptick in the maltreatment of refugees at the hands of their Chinese neighbors. So while I've been here, I was able to find some mentions of Chinese passerbys in the post-war period throwing rocks at refugees, throwing banana peels at refugees, calling for them to leave. The growing resentment towards Jewish refugees on the part of the Chinese also parallels a growing resentment that the Chinese had for American troops. American troops were increasingly seen as being reckless, drunk, disrespectful, and even dangerous to the Chinese around them by many Chinese sources. According to the historian Hong Zhang, from the arrival of the US troops in September of 1945 to July 1946, around 1,500 Chinese injuries and deaths involved Americans stationed in China. On top of this, American troops were exempt from the Chinese criminal code. And this made some Chinese feel like they were still living in a time of extraterritoriality. So we can imagine that for the many Jewish refugees who aligned themselves with US troops, either by working for them or associating with them, these refugees may have been lumped into the charges that the Chinese were levying against the Americans in China. Nonetheless, not all Jewish refugees were able to get jobs with the American forces. Those with criminal records were mostly barred from assuming service positions. These refugees, however, still emulated American behavior at times, albeit for different reasons. Records from the Shanghai Municipal Archive indicate that the presence of US troops in Shanghai presented a number of Jewish refugees the occasion to impersonate American personnel and employees. Refugees with no means of other employment often seized opportunities to defraud other foreigners, Chinese, and one another. capitalizing on their foreignness to ameliorate the harsh conditions in which they lived, refugees cheated others who trusted their feigned ties to American institutions on the ground. An interesting example of such a case is that of Max Hamburger. Max Hamburger was a 28-year-old German Jewish refugee who pretended to be foreign aviation personnel between 1946 and 1947 in an attempt to sell 4 stolen Jeeps to a Chinese garage owner. In this ploy, Hamburger put together a hodgepodge uniform consisting of a second-hand foreign uniform jacket, a purchase cap, and a badge. Hamburger subsequently made up an American boss, who he called Mr. Jensen, on whose behalf he claimed to sell these Jeeps. He then falsified the bills of ownership and sale of these Jeeps with Mr. Jensen's fake signature. Now, this case obviously raised a lot of questions for me, but the largest question that first came to my mind is, where did Hamburger buy parts of these uniforms, or how did he come into possession of these uniforms? And while searching through the VHA here, I found this clip of a refugee named Henry Glazer, who specifically talks about the circulation of foreign army uniforms.
And I got a job within a month with the air transport command. 1580 Space Air Corps, the United States Army Air Force. And I became CQ, EOQ, which was in charge of quarters and the base officer quarters, which is basically, I was the hotel clerk for the base officer quarters. But I had great advantages because I could eat in the mess hall, and I almost had officer privileges. I could move all over the place, and because of that, the officers who left, and there was a point system which allowed people to leave the military. They accumulated points for service, years service, and the pilots for flying time and so on. And they all were waiting to go home on points. And so I dealt with all of these officers who were ready to go home. And going home means getting rid of everything that they didn't want to carry. And it included uniforms, clothing of all kinds, and which they gave away. And I was the one who got them because I was the CQ, POQ, well, who would you give it to when you leave? So I sold a lot of stuff on the market, on the black market, which became the American uniforms and clothing became really a major trading point. I wouldn't know what to do with it, if I wore all the shirts and the jackets I could, I didn't know what to do with that.
So here, from Glazer's testimony, we can learn that there were potentially a large amount of foreign uniforms circulating on the black market that would have been available for Jewish refugees to purchase. So we can see that refugees who did not necessarily work for American armed services may still have had access to the privileges that American troops had on the ground by virtue of being able to dress and to pass as Americans. So I just wanted to show a photo of Henry Glazer acting as the charge of quarters here. So in the last leg of my presentation, I want to make sure I address the topic of gender in relation to Jewish refugees' experiences with American troops and their Chinese neighbors. Now, while Chinese and Jewish refugees alike were thrilled at first by the arrival of the American troops, there is evidence to believe that Jewish women may also have feared being sexually assaulted by American soldiers. Evelyn Rubin, who's pictured here on the right in Shanghai, and also who was the little girl in the Japanese pass from before, she remembered this fear. In her testimony in the VHA, she said, "The first thing we were told, all the Jewish girls should stay off the streets, that the American soldiers were running around raping everything female in sight." She also remembered being told not to go to school, because the Navy was on a rampage, as they had been at sea for so long. While Reuben thankfully did not experience any sexual harassment or assault at the hands of any American soldiers, Jewish women may have had more mixed feelings and also mixed experiences with US troops in the city. That being said, the arrival of the US troops in Shanghai also offered Jewish refugee women the opportunity to form romantic relationships with American soldiers. Given that some Jewish refugees still struggled financially, forming relationships with American GIs allowed women to acquire chocolate, stockings, and new clothing for themselves. Jewish refugee women at times even married American soldiers, either out of love or to qualify for immigration out of Shanghai, or for the monetary advantages that these unions provided. Through marriage or romantic relationships, Jewish women could either legally become American or at least benefit from American resources. Now, in terms of Jewish refugee men, I have some limited evidence that shows that the post-war period allowed refugee men, especially those who worked for American troops, to visit Chinese prostitutes more frequently. In the VHA, there are some mentions of Jewish refugees visiting Chinese prostitutes, but I've yet to determine if there's a real change over time from the wartime to the post-war period from these mentions alone. So here in this photo, you can see a refugee named Gerhard Brieger, who did discuss in his testimony visiting Chinese prostitutes. Nonetheless, it's well documented in the historical record that the US soldiers in Shanghai often engaged the services of Chinese prostitutes. As Shanghai was a city of repatriation for US soldiers, and also a destination where many soldiers spent their time on leave in the Pacific, Shanghai has been remembered as having been a playground for US soldiers. So this is a photo of a refugee named Kurt Levy, and he has a really interesting story because he was in Shanghai and was actually able to make it to America, I believe in 1941, and then joined the US, I believe, Army, and was stationed in the Pacific, and went back to Shanghai in the post-war period as an American soldier to visit his friends and family still in Shanghai. So I thought I'd show this photo. But nonetheless, the extent to which Jewish refugees may have actually partaken in these types of behaviors is something I still need to suss out further. Now, moving forward with this project, I do hope to add further Chinese source materials and documentation to truly flesh out the ways Chinese may have seen Jewish refugees and Americans during this time period. And I would also like to survey American soldiers' treatment of Jewish refugees. Certain testimonies I've come across during my time here at the VHA have elucidated that some refugees may have received anti-Semitic comments and remarks from American troops on the ground. As an example, I'd like to show the testimony of Rita Fader, who first worked at a PX and then in an office for the US Armed Forces.
But later on, I took typing lessons, and I went to work for the Air Force Supply in an office because I didn't want to be in the PX any longer, and I wanted to learn to type. And I think I mentioned I ran into one sergeant who was from Texas, and when I heard that I got my visa to come to the United States, I was walking on air. I mean, my feet did not touch the ground. Even though my parents couldn't go, it was just me and my brother. The Polish quota had not opened up, and we were German quota, but my parents said, "You two go."
So they would take you, but not your parents?
Not my parents, no, because the Polish quota was closed.
And when was this?
This was in 1947, and I was really, I was beside myself. Here, I'm going to the United States, I'm going to Los Angeles, and the sergeant looked at me and said, I hope your ship sinks. He said, there are too many goddamn Jews in the United States already. My adrenaline started to go, and I picked up the typewriter, and I literally was going to throw it at him if they didn't stop me. I was like, I could not believe that this came out of the mouth of an American soldier who, to me, represented freedom, liberty, everything that I ever wanted in my whole life, and this man is standing there in front of me. I said, this is anti-Semitism all over again, but I will not stand for it any longer, no more. And I promised him, and I kept my promise. Before I left, he would be busted. This man had no right to be representing the United States Army. And I did, and he got busted.
So just so you know, yeah. Feder did report this sergeant to the sergeant's superior, and she remembers that the sergeant was then reprimanded and also never bothered her again. But I think from Feder's testimony, we can see that while Jewish refugees may have dreamed of becoming Americans in Shanghai during the post-war period, American troops may not have always been as accepting. While many dreamed of America while in Shanghai and acted on those dreams in China, a large number of Jewish refugees never made it to the United States. Those who were unable to gain entry to the US left for Israel, Canada, and Germany. But for those who were able to come to the United States, officially becoming American has remained one of their proudest moments. So here, at the end of my presentation, I'd like to end with the testimony of a refugee named Fred Marcus, who was able to become an American. And in this clip, he recalls going back to Shanghai later in life in search of memories and finding himself in the middle of a crowd of Chinese people.
I heard somebody in the crowd say, looking over his neighbor, Nakoning, foreigners. And it was at this point that some of my Chinese, very limited, came back to me, and with great pride, I pulled myself up and I yelled back at this unseen voice, Mekoning, I'm an American. And that was one of the high points of my life, to go back to that place and to be able to say there, I'm an American.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. I just wanted to mention what I forgot to mention is that this is what you just heard. It's not the end of a dissertation project. She is not even in the middle yet. So this is very, I have to say, I think that's enormous already what she accomplished. And the second thing what I wanted to mention before we open the floor for comments and questions is what you have seen now in the PowerPoint here is also remarkable, because we are having now fellows for several years and PhD candidates, and they mostly focus on the videos, the video testimonies. I think Kimberly is the first one who extensively actually worked with the photographs at the end of every testimony, which most people don't know that the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive contains 700,000 photographs, and which is an enormous archive in itself. It deserves actually academic research as well, and I think she already kind of put this to work. Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions.
So one of the testimony, I don't remember the name of the interviewee. You have a kind of Asian artifacts, you know. Is it something that is explained in the testimony?
You know,
I'm not knowledgeable, but is it Chinese set or is it more?
that dawned on me actually this morning as I was running through my presentation, and it was actually the first time I noticed the background. I think I was so focused on looking explicitly for certain references, and so I actually still need to look into where the testimony was taken, by whom, and also the circumstances, so the setting. And I think what's really great about the VHA is they're also pre-interview questionnaires and form materials that can be accessed only here on site. And so I'm hoping to find some of that information in that material. So I can certainly keep you updated on what I find. And I even think a lot of these testimonies are shot in the homes of refugees at most points. And so I think that's even interesting to see what setting they choose, whether there is Asian art or they have artifacts shown. And I think that shows or could demonstrate really the mark that their time in Shanghai may have left on refugees that is often taken for granted. Sure.
Two very short questions. When you started your project, were you planning on working on the post-war period? And second, do you know of any American memoirs or any recollections about people that were stationed in or worked in Shanghai? Any American perspectives?
Sure. I originally did not intend to work on the post-war period, but I kept noticing, especially I like to work with memoirs a lot in conjunction with testimonies, and I kept noticing in a lot of memoirs, because refugees definitely want to get to the next stage of life that they set up for themselves, they say, the war ended and we were there until 47 or 48 and then we left. And so sometimes it's just a page or it's 2 pages, when in reality they're there for 2 or 3 years, still living their lives, fashioning new lives for themselves in this new climate. And so that was where this project really kind of emerged for me. And thankfully with the testimonies at the VHA, because some interviewees ask further questions, there seems to be more material about how refugees remembered living in the post-war era. And I noticed that in terms of scholarship as well. So I think researchers have really wanted to study where refugees go after China, how they get there, who funds how they get there, what aid organizations are involved. And so there really is less of a focus about kind of the change in their state, in their living conditions on the ground in this period. And then I'm sorry, can you remind me your second question? Oh, yes. So I'm starting to look into American perspectives, and while I've been here, I was able actually to find, I think maybe 2 or 3 so far, testimonies of, I think they're labeled as liberators, and so they're testimonies of American soldiers who did go to Asia and were in Shanghai and remember conditions on the ground and also remember meeting Jewish refugees. And there are 1 or 2 testimonies of such as Kurt Levy, who kind of straddles both fields, and there's some mentions in Jewish testimonies of relatives doing the same thing as Kurt, and then coming back as American soldiers. And so I definitely need to hone in on that more moving forward.
Yeah, Kimberly, I wanted to come back to the gender question, which you touched upon in your presentation. And you talked a lot before that about men got hired by U.S. forces. Can you just elaborate a little bit? Were there also many women hired by U.S. forces? Was this equal, or were there differences? Also, kind of where they were kind of staffed. And then the second question is, you mentioned that there was a rumor and anxiety or fear of being raped by U.S. soldiers. Does this have anything to do with, let's say, with the experience of the Japanese invasion? Is this a reason why people thought any soldier would rape women? Or were there other reasons why people would have this rumor?
Right. Those are 2 really great questions. I know as I was putting together this presentation, some of the best examples of Americans working, or refugees working for Americans, I realized that they were all male speakers. And so I definitely didn't want to give the impression that there were no females that worked for the armed forces. From my limited research so far, I do believe that Jewish refugee women were hired a lot to work at kind of base exchanges, so as cashiers. It seems many of them were also typists or secretaries, as we can think of Rita Fader's testimony where she remembers learning to type. I have yet to find as much evidence that Jewish refugee women traveled outside of Shanghai or were stationed with American troops or brought along to other cities. So we can think of Peter Shatner going to Manchuria. There are some testimonies where Jewish refugees went along to Nanjing for certain periods of time to help the Kuomintang nationalists. So I'm still trying to suss out really what the divide is and in types of roles, and then also the prevalence of just being hired. So that's a great target point for me. And I also, I hadn't really come across mentions of Jewish women fearing the coming of American soldiers. And so this testimony of Evelyn Rubin really opened up a lot of doors for me. So I definitely would like to think of where those rumors come from. And perhaps it may come down to even just experiences of soldiers. But I guess in terms of Japanese soldiers were in Shanghai and kind of monitoring Jewish refugees, and they had a lot of exposure to Japanese soldiers on the street. And I haven't seen as much fear of Japanese soldiers, so I'm not sure exactly how to draw the comparison of, is it just the category of soldier, or does it have to do something with American soldiers? And I also don't really know in the post-war period yet what type of news they're hearing from Europe and American soldiers in Europe. So it's definitely a very good target point for me.
One question, coming back to the interactions between the two groups, what was, I definitely think that some of the immigrants, they related to other European immigrants already there and have relations to them more than, or towards them because they wanted to, how much contact they had and learned Chinese or had other relations that they were told maybe in their experiences before, since you are doing after the period after, now focusing more on the period after, if there's any balance of their narrative, so telling the time before and after, not only in the sense that how much it has changed, but how those relations are being influenced, also with the previous people that they have.
Right, and that's definitely a good point. For me, originally when I started this project, I really was just so focused on Jewish refugee relations with the Chinese and what are those interactions like. And I'm starting to realize that their refugees' relationships with the people around them really inform those interactions. So you mentioned the Europeans in the city, and I'm trying to suss out now, especially in the earlier years of refugee migration when refugees were able to live in the French concession, to what extent did refugees mimic behavior of other foreigners in the city, learn certain attitudes. So I'm thinking specifically right now, some of my work looks at refugees who are able to have Chinese domestic servants. And so what type of treatment they might have seen Europeans give these types of domestic servants, other foreign Europeans, and really if they pick up on that or not. But yeah, I am finding that it is hard kind of, it doesn't seem like refugees really give much thought to their changing relationship or with the Chinese people around them from the war to the post-war period. Given that a lot of refugees don't really talk about the post-war period as being particularly noteworthy, they're very excited to talk about their future lives and other destinations that they leave for. And so it has been a lot of kind of detective work for me to figure out, even just passing mentions of, and then I remember in the post-war period, my neighbors would throw stones at me more, and I don't see that before. I hope I answered your question, but it's really helpful to have those points raised for me.
Well, so my question relates to what you just said. Like I'm thinking about, learning so much about folks who were living in Shanghai in like 1947 and preparing or hoping to move to the United States. And I think, one of the things that I'm interested in is like, where do you think Holocaust studies what are the boundaries of Holocaust studies as I think it would be a field or as a subfield, and then how are you thinking about those boundaries from that? I think it would be from methods or disciplinary perspective, because I guess I'm just trying to. How broad is it? How big is it in the way that you're relating to it?
Right. I'm going to try to answer this question. For me, I think I'm going to keep this micro and kind of use examples of what I'm currently thinking about in terms of my project. In Chinese history, for example, there is a large exploration of kind of questions of empire. So in this project, we can see that there are different foreign contingents and occupiers in Shanghai. And so people in Chinese history are starting to study and think about the different types of contingents that would have been in the city. And also, if we're thinking about kind of foreign occupiers and then the Chinese, if they're third-party people, third-party members at play. And so we think of, I've seen studies now thinking about Sikh policemen that were in Shanghai, or American businessmen, or what it would have meant to be a Chinese Christian and how you would have aligned differently in that sphere. And so for me, that raises the question of what do we do with Jewish refugees in the city if we're thinking about this grand landscape of all these different contingents. And so I guess to keep it very micro, I'm interested in transporting certain questions that have in some respects been talked about in the Holocaust studies, but kind of migrating some of those questions from East Asian studies in specific into my work and seeing whether or not that really changes the picture of this story as it's been previously told in Jewish studies. So I will spare, I'm going to need to think a little more about kind of the grander scope of the field, but I hope that gave you a little taste of what I was thinking, or what I've been thinking.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And we are now out of time, but you can still converse with Kimberly, I guess.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.